So which armies won and lost the most from the big balance update? Let's talk through every single army in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking balanced Dataslate things. In this one I thought it would be interesting to take a video to talk through the changes, roughly where each army was before in terms of in-game power, and then how I think that the alterations that Games Workshop made might have sent them, whether they won or lost overall, and if so, by how much. It's now been a couple of days for the dust to settle on the big update. I'd say that this one hasn't been quite as monumental a change to the game as the enormous Pariah Nexus Dataslate update that we had in summer. That one was always going to feel like a bit of a bigger one though, due to having the entire new mission pack at the same time. The core changes to the game were at least fairly limited. 3-inch deep strikes changed to 6-inch ones and no longer working with rapid ingress. Armour of Contempt only working against one unit. And then we had a bunch of points and faction updates, some factions getting loads of attention for better or worse, like Space Marines and Sisters, a lot of armies getting kind of minimal or no changes though, and they were kind of light on the points for this one. I feel like their aim was to get most of the points changes in the previous update, and then this one was more for rules. I'll talk a bit about Grotmus detachments for this one as well, which we're currently only halfway through, but they do basically feel like part of the update really. In any case though, let's go through each faction in turn, do a quick recap of their changes, and roughly how much I think it's impacted them. First up for the Space Marines, they weren't in the best place for the core codex prior to the update, around about 45% wins, though certain Ultramarines lists were taking down tournaments from time to time, and besides the big draw of Ultramarines characters, a lot of the other chapters were just kind of suffering due to comparison, basically just being flatly inferior ways to play an army versus say either Ultramarines or the Divergent chapters. Games Workshop didn't hold back on the Space Marine changes though. A huge amount of alterations, including plenty of things for individual datasheets. There certainly were a few nerfs thrown in there, but it definitely felt more positive than negative. For the points increases, we got ones to Marnie's Calgar, Uriel Ventris, and Scouts. I guess the Calgar and Ventris ones to try and take the emphasis off Ultramarines just a little bit, and the Scouts increase did seem like a little blow, given that they tended to be quite so auto-included in a lot of lists. Besides that though, we got Sternguard with rerolling all wound rolls against Oath of Moment, Rabute Gilliman getting both his strats and his double oath, Heavy Intercessors getting the big damage 2 bolt rifles, and Furnace Marines getting AP1 for 90 points. Intercessors essentially double shooting with their bolt rifles, meaning that they clear out chaff super easily now. Outriders are strength 5 and damage 2 on the charge and look genuinely fearsome as a melee unit. Reavers now debuff objective control and gained a bit of OC on their knives. Combat knives generally also got improved, which helps out things like incursors. The Repulsor Executioner transport 7, and several chapter specific characters now add extra OC to various different units, giving a handy extra incentive to playing those lesser played chapters. Of course though, quite apart from datasheet changes, the really big one was the Oath of Moment change. A +1 to the wound roll is really big for core Codex Marines. It means that any one big target is just going to be so much easier to take down for them now, and it's definitely helpful for Gilliman, given that he can double up on that. The mild boost to Overwatch now being able to trigger whether or not a charge move is made could help out the Land Raider Redeemer slightly. Inceptors traded out their 3-inch drop for a 6-inch one, but did get a small points decrease. And the new Librarius Conclave looks like it's got a rather daft Sternguard combo until that gets patched out, potentially dropping something like 25 odd mortal wounds on an enemy vehicle, which is pretty daft, which certainly seems enough to be tempting to build around. Finally, we did have one solid nerf to Gladius Fire Discipline, the best enhancement, basically just being no longer worth it anymore, with 40 points just for sustained hits, breaking the big sustained lethal combo that it could get on a 5+ with a Lieutenant. We also got the Armour of Contempt's nerf as well, which seems more relevant to Space Marines than anyone else given that it's in all their detachments, plus they've got units that really profit from it like Dreadnoughts or Land Raiders. There's definitely been some rough with the smooth here. Armour of Contempt, Fire Discipline, Uriel and Marnie is getting nerfed, and Scouts going up a bit, all those feel like they will actually solidly take away from Space Marine power. But I certainly feel like it's outweighed by Boosted Oath and the amount of datasheets that went from kind of mid to being genuinely quite scary. And I feel like perhaps the biggest impact now is that Oath of Moment giving you a genuinely good reason to play core Codex Space Marines, as opposed to just embrace the Divergent chapters for more options. I feel like we might see a bit more success for them as a result. I feel like for Ultramarines players, I feel like there was perhaps a bit more give and take, given a couple of great datasheets getting nerfed, though Gilliman with double new Oath of Moment seems rather scary, but does seem to be mostly win for all the non-Ultramarines Codex chapters, as a result of giving them winners overall here. Next up, we've got the Imperial Guard. Pre-updates, they were one of the strongest armies in the game, with win rates of around about 54%, and won more tournaments than any other army since the last update. I think basically everyone is expecting them to get some nerfs, and Games Workshop went with some scattergun small points raises. Cadians and Kaschans both went up, as did Chimeras and Hellhounds. Chimeras at 85 points definitely feel a lot less efficient. Scions went up to 60, Gaunts goes to 110, and bigger squads of Ogrins were raised as well if you were spamming those. The biggest nerfs to the faction though, I feel like, were Lord Solar and the Tempestus Aquilons. The Aquilons with their 3-inch deep strike were kind of crazy, but losing that was definitely a power loss for the faction overall. And this is the update where they finally decided to tone down Lord Solar a bit, allowing him to only order squadron and regiment units and now costing 150 points. I still think he'll be worth it, but he has been a bit restricted. He won't be good for ordering Borgren squads about anymore. I was a bit unfortunate for super heavies to get a nerf that way basically. It's not like they were the strongest thing anyway. Finally, we did also get a new datasheet for Ratlings with an option for a 10-man squad with some other fun gear. Unfortunately, that bigger squad size just doesn't really look very competitive. It's not like the smaller squad size tended to get used much anyway. Overall, they're certainly losers compared with where they were before. The Lord Solar and Tempestus Aquilon nerfs do seem really quite direct ones that'll impact faction strength, as will the bigger and smaller hits to the other staples. Feels like the emphasis has been pushed even further towards tank spam as the way to go. Lots of Russes and Dawns with support, and maybe a bit more emphasis on the Deathcore Krieg and maybe Sentinels and Rough Riders to go forward and take the mid-board. I still feel like Guard have got enough interesting options in their codex that they're not going to flip from being good to weak out of this, probably just more mid-tier. Currently we still have a Grotmus detachment to come as well, which could maybe be Scions, and otherwise the codex is just around the corner, which will change absolutely loads anyway, so whatever happens with their power right now, it'll be kind of short-lived. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titans Terrain, who wanted to share their cunning terrain system, basically of fold out cardboard tiles, where one box of it can fold out to create an entire pop-up Warhammer 40k battlefield instantly. The idea behind them is that you have basically 12 tiles in a grid to make a 45 by 60 inch board. Each of those tiles deploys to make a fold out pop-up building, so you basically have a 40k terrain battlefield that can be stored completely flat at a moment's notice. And the tile design makes it super easy to transport as well, being able to go small enough to fit in a normal sized board game style box. For other advantages, they're far cheaper than a Games Workshop terrain set, as just about everything is really. It doesn't require any hobby effort to push it on the board if you don't have time for an entire terrain set, with most people's inevitable backlog of plastic models. In any case, there'll be links down in the video description if you want to check out their range, and I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video if you want to see a little bit more, talking through a few of their options and a few of the pros and cons of their rather different take on terrain. Carrying on with our look through the 40k armies though, next up we have the Adeptus Mechanicus. They were pretty well balanced prior to the update, with win rates around about 49%. As ever with them though, they're not a particularly widely collected faction due to the expense of them, and it seems they hadn't won any big tournaments since the last update, maybe partly due to bad luck, but still maybe not a ringing endorsement of their strength. A few direct nerfs to some of their best Skitarii Hunter cohort units probably didn't help too much last time around. That still has remained their best detachment. For the balance update this time around, the changes were kind of minimal. Castel and robots got cheaper by 5 points each, dropping down to 180 for a pair of them rather than 190. And for their new detachment for December, they got the Halo Screed one, the one where tech priests assume direct control of a unit and can hand out some different buffs for them, plus have some really quite nice supporting stratagems just in general. Overall, doesn't seem like it's been a bad balance update for them. I put them down as slight winners overall. I don't think 180 points is going to make Castel and robots good in Hunter cohort, but could now be a bit more tempting in Cybernetica cohort and the new Halo Screed one where they can get the Doctriner Imperatives. They can be fairly nasty in Conqueror at least. It'll be interesting to see whether the Grotmus detachment competes with the Hunter cohort. I feel like it's got a fair few interesting interactions and pretty nasty damage combos with the Cataphoron Servitors on paper. Games Workshop do feel like they've rather let down the Emperor's Faithful in this balance change though. It was almost nothing but bad news for the Adeptus Sororitas. I kind of felt like they'd got their balance cycles a bit out of sync. They were really quite dominant prior to the last points update, but having had a whole load of things go up, often by fairly large margins, they were far more balanced, winning around about 50% of games. I guess doing okay at a top tournament kind of level, but definitely with their weaknesses, very expensive units, and not exactly out-competing a bunch of other factions doing well. For their points changes, they got nerfs to the Castigator and Exorcist. The Castigator one was definitely big, given that there were 2 or more of them in most lists, and certainly some people were spamming Exorcists for some murderous indirect fire. The edge has definitely been taken off that with a big 20-point boost. Those 2 changes are kind of overshadowed though with the massive nerf to Miracle Dice, basically halving the amount of them available from the turns and battle rounds, and also stopping you from generating any more when things are all slain in the same phase, and there's just going to be far less of them going around. The Triumph also got absolutely slammed as well, just modifying the result of a Miracle Dice to a 6 and not generating a new one, which in no way justifies the 250 point cost anymore. As if that weren't enough, the Brigands of Flame were nerfed in 5 different ways. I kind of get Games Workshop wanting to even up internal balance within the detachments, but it really feels like a bit of a bad triple nerf when taken into context of the tank increases and the Miracle Dice changes. Basically, Armour of Contempt got nerfed, 2 stratagems went to 2 command points, the +1 strength range dropped down to 6 inches, so harder to use there, and one of the other stratagems had similar for its close range attack. It's definitely still a detachment that still has some interesting options, but that really was a pretty painful battery of nerfs. The only positive one was the Penitent Host being changed to allow a little bit more flexibility with when you pick the buffs, though I'm not sure that's going to make the difference of it becoming hugely competitively relevant. Overall, as a result, it feels like they were really quite big losers for the second update in a row. It feels like the first one toned them down from being a bit overpowered to kind of fine, and this one seems on paper likely to take them from kind of fine to genuinely quite weak. I feel like perhaps the most objectionable bit to the changes are the Miracle Dice nerfs. I think the rest of it I could kind of get for hitting auto-include options, but the Miracle Dice add a lot of strength to the faction, and that's just being cut in half, seemingly without any enormously good balance reasons. It certainly isn't a feeling of fun either to basically have your army's special thing be far less impactful. As a result, I guess they're probably going to be one of the lower mid or weaker factions in 40k, and I wouldn't be too surprised if a lot of people pivot towards Hallowed Martyrs as the way to play them, and focus on some character revival shenanigans maybe with Morven Varl. Certainly on paper, just throwing this many massive nerfs at a faction that was kind of mid-tier seems really quite questionable though. Next up, for the Adeptus Custodes, they had their bikes improved. Pre-update, they had wins of around about 49%, notably winning the World Champions of Warhammer, but beyond that, not really much success in top events, most players choosing to use the Shield host, though it was a Talons list that won the World Champions. For the points changes, they got increases on Virtus Praetors for 150 points per 2 of them, and a Jetbike Captain for 160. Though they were due to the big improvements they got, they both got far better shooting with salvo launchers that are actually somewhat of a menace to enemy vehicles and damage 2 bolters. They both got +1 toughness and +1 wound, and toughness 7 bikes with 5 wounds is a lot chunkier compared with the toughness 6 and 4 that they were before. And the Virtus Praetor specifically actually now has a rule that functions for their special rule, meaning that they might be able to inflict that mortal wound damage in a turn where they also shoot and charge. Overall, I feel like it's enough to make the bikes be a competitively relevant unit again, though I don't think it's necessarily enough to make them auto-include or anything like that. They just feel like a solid option once more. The new detachment for Grotmus was the Dreadnought-focused one, mainly just let down a little bit by the overall strength of the Dreadnought datasheets, I feel. Though certainly with the bike changes, the ability to charge through walls for them is quite a nasty one. Overall, feels like the Custodes are slight winners compared with before. I feel like the two main changes mainly just add options to them as opposed to direct strength. It'll be interesting to see whether anyone's trying out the Dreadnought detachment or the bikes in tournament lists. Next up, we've got the Grey Knights that haven't been doing so well on a tournament performance level. They dropped down to 45% win rates, which I'm not 100% too sure of the cause of, because they were winning around about 50% prior to the last update, and basically just got a small buff with that. But it seems that top players out there just aren't really having much faith on them being able to win events. It feels a bit disappointing then that this time around they seem to have mainly got nerfs. Dread Knights went up 5 points, which doesn't really change too much, but not really helpful. True Silver Armour being worse is a big deal for them with their 2+ saves. That could be really quite a potent durability stratagem, and the 3-inch Deep Strike being nerfed across the board also hits their Teleport Strike Force hard. Given the nerfs to the Teleport Strike Force, maybe that new detachment with the Purifiers might look a bit better. I feel like the amount of trade-off seemed like quite a bit prior to the update, but now they're far less so due to the armour and the Deep Strike being nerfed. It certainly looks like you can get a whole bunch of damage in the new detachment with the sheer amount of rerolls they have, plus a few nice punchy stratagems. Maybe Purifiers could lead a bunch of Dread Knights into the fray, rerolling Psy-Cannon hits and big melee attacks. It'll be interesting to see whether or not that does well when you lose things like the Advanced Shoot Charge and the improved teleport tricks. In general though, I broadly rate them as more losers than winners compared with previously. Next up, we've got the Imperial Knights, who were fairly well balanced previously, around about 50% win rates, generally tending to do better at small tournaments than the great big ones, as is usually their way with a slightly simplistic playstyle with big stat lines and heavy weapons, though maybe a little bit less room for subtle play. Their balance update really was a bit of a surprise. Armiger Helverins and Armiger Warglaves both dropped 10 points for seemingly no good reason. I'm really not sure what the motivation behind that one was. Both were really solid before. There's been plenty of army lists that go very heavy on them, and I guess there's a chance that there'll be a few more armies that go heavier on them still. Otherwise, their Grotmus detachment was a bit of a disappointment power-wise, I think. The allied Admech one I can't really see doing too well in any sort of competitive setting. In any case, definitely looks helpful for Imperial Knights. The vast majority of the list that they play will be gaining something like 40 to 70 points, perhaps even more if you're only running one big knight before, and to give you enough points for either more allies, another enhancement or two, and probably just tilts Imperial Knights to run more armigers and fewer big knights than they were doing before, perhaps with a few more top lists just running one or even none. Seems like they'll be in for a fairly good time though, getting a direct power boost when being pretty well balanced already. Probably will make them a handful to deal with, and perhaps particularly at either lower points levels or more casual games. The Space Wolves were also around about a 50% win rate, using both Stormlance and Champions of Rust to good success since the last update. They got a small nerf to Wolfern in going up 5 points per 5 of them. Wolf Scouts went up 5 like the regular ones, but did gain AP1 on knives if they take them. And then otherwise they got the big Space Marine changes, the Armour of Contempt nerf, but loads of big buffs to several datasheets. For the Space Wolves and a lot of the melee chapters, I feel like the Outriders could be an interesting one, in particular for the Space Wolves in their Stormlance though. They often liked running Stormlance anyway due to the Thunderwolves. Maybe some Outriders could actually be justifiable to find their way in there. They do hit as hard as Thunderwolves do on the charge now. Overall feels like some positives and negatives. The Wolfen nerf and the Armour of Contempt both won't help. Outriders being good and Sternguard being able to spam some devastating wounds both seem nice. Though as with the rest of the Divergent chapters, they might have lost some ground against the Core Codex, due to the Core Codex Marines having boosted Oath there. For the Blood Angels, they had win rates of around about 51% after their Codex launch, basically everyone running the Liberator Assault group. They often seem to like a few big punchy melee bricks, with things like Sanguinary Guard or Death Company with Lamatis, potentially some Jump Intercessors and Mephiston, and maybe some firepower tanks to back them up. In this update, they got cheaper Sanguinary Guard by 5 points, more expensive Mephiston by 10, and 15 points more on the Rage-Fueled Warrior Warlord trait. That's the one that can give them a sustained hits 3 captain, and then he can trigger that on the same turn as he does with his extra attacks, giving you a fairly crazy stack of stats that can threaten to wipe out a whole bunch of things in the game if he's next to some Assault Intercessors. Then they got the Codex Space Marine changes. Again, they'll be most focused on melee stuff. I feel like Scouts with AP1 knives could actually be kind of interesting. You could have some pretty scary first turn charge things happening there when they're getting extra attacks and strength 6. Outriders would also slam home with strength 7, damage 2 and extra attacks as well, which seems brutal. Though like the rest they did get hit by the Armour of Contempt nerf. Overall though, doesn't really seem too bad for them. Sanguinary Guard being cheaper will definitely help, as will those core Space Marine melee things. Mephiston, Rage-Fueled Warrior and Armour of Contempt are all downsides though. Feels like they've gained a bit, lost a bit. It still feels like Mephiston and Rage-Fueled Warrior are worth taking if you want to. Next up for the Dark Angels, they'd been winning around about 46% of games, a little bit lower than the Blood Angels and the Space Wolves, and they'd largely been doing so with Gladius Task Force. For their changes, the line went up to 315 points, but he gains damage 2 on his sweep attacks, meaning that he's far better against things like standard Space Marines now. The 3-inch Deep Strike affects the Deathwing detachment slightly with one of their enhancements there. They'll take the Armour of Contempt nerf, and the Gladius Fire Discipline nerf is a really big deal for them, given that they were using that for their core detachment quite a lot, but beyond that they received really quite a lot of help for the Raven Wing. For those, their Company of Hunters now allows mounted units to shoot and charge after advancing and falling back. Black Knights gain devastating wounds. Samael gives you charge and advance bonuses, including in his detachment, where previously he was a bit redundant, and Outriders having the strength 5 damage 2 on the charge is certainly better for the Raven Wing. That's a massive boost to one of the units that they most need to build around. Finally, they do have their new detachment for Raven Wing plus Deathwing. I feel like given the Outrider changes, that actually could be significantly better than it was before, and certainly gaining a bunch of ground on Gladius as well. Now Fire Discipline is no longer a thing worth taking. Overall, I feel like it might depend on the sort of Dark Angels army that you might have been running. With those changes, the Raven Wing units definitely look more interesting. Extremely scary with how fast they can move and then deal good damage in their detachment. Though maybe if you're going for more standard melee Dark Angels, they're probably slight losers, between things like Armour of Contempt getting toned down and Gladius getting hit. Hopefully these buffs will be enough to actually have the Raven Wing compete properly again. I'm sure we'll still see plenty of people taking the line, who I feel like has done fairly well out of that update. He is pricier, but he's definitely a bit more general purpose with the targets he can take down easily. Next up for the Black Templars, they were on a similar sort of level. Win rates are around about 46%. In the last update they received some nerfs, Hellbretts, Grimoldus and big Crusader squads going up probably a bit more than they needed to. For this time, aside from the core Codex Marine changes, things were kind of minimal. Both repulsors are now just 10 points more for the multi-melter upgrade. I feel that is kind of sensible, and that's a fairly good price for the bolt-on gun. The repulsor Executioner had its transport expanded in the same way as Space Marines. and then it was just the core codex changes, Stern Guard, Outriders, Infernus Marines and Intercessors and things, plus the Armour of Contempt nerf. I guess for their more melee focus in their Righteous Crusaders, maybe the Outriders again could be one of the more interesting units, both being fairly fast and tough and pretty dangerous on the charge. Overall seems like they'll probably be fairly similar, though it does feel like an update that's probably made their unique stuff less relevant if anything. Lots of buffs for more core codex options, not so much for their unique stuff. I feel like the Armour of Contempt nerf will further hurt their durable Crusader squad bricks where you want to put loads of durability and feel no pain on them. Enemy focused fire isn't all going to be able to have Armour of Contempt work on it anymore. Finally, for the Divergent chapters, we've got the return of Deathwatch, who feel like big winners overall just due to only being playable in Imperial Agents. Previously, they were near enough unplayed in Warhammer 40k. Almost no one was playing Imperial Agents, and out of those, most people were going for Imperialis fleet as opposed to anything Deathwatch focused. In place of a Grotmus detachment, they got their index restored to them, including mixed Primaris kill teams coming back, and they picked up some boosted bolters with better strength and AP. Otherwise, it's mostly the same Black Spear Task Force style rules, though they could use other detachments including the Librarius one, which on paper looks quite good with their Scary Terminator datasheets, and again they'll be able to access all of the souped up units from Space Marines too. Overall though, feels like they're in at least a fairly good place with their big power combo kill teams. It looks like they've probably got enough good stuff to be able to be competitive. It'll be cool to see what people make of them and whether or not they have some success at the top of tournaments. Finally for the Imperium, we've got the codex that they left behind, the Imperial Agents. As mentioned, they're just not really getting played too much in competitive events, even if one or two people have managed to make them work. Their index just has a massive amount of problems, and it does look like Games Workshop at least intends you to be able to field them as a faction if you want to, but for this balance update, they didn't decide to do any efforts to try to make that possible at all. They still lack a faction rule if you field them independently, which seems like a big miss. Never mind the fact that army just has issues like not really having anything that can deal with heavy tanks and things outside of allied knights. I guess if you want to run armies or warglaves, then that got a little bit cheaper. Otherwise though, they just had their allied Vindicator option drop down to 125. He's a fair bit less painful than the 150, though still seems like he's probably paying over the odds for what he does. And otherwise the Calexus was hit by the 3-inch drop nerf, perhaps even further cementing the Calidus as the objective support assassin to take. I'd seen a few people run the Calexus. Otherwise, they got their assassin-themed attachment, which does have a few interesting things, but is rather undone by the massive points cost that the upgraded assassins cost, which I feel like for most of the enhancements are like 30 points more than they should be, and currently feels rather dead on arrival even compared with the other detachments in a weak codex. At least the Deathwatch element of them have gained a new lease of life, but it does kind of feel like they're just losers overall due to having big problems and no changes. Hopefully Games Workshop will be a bit nicer to them in a future update. Moving on to Chaos next, and first up we have the Heretic Astartes in Chief with the Chaos Marines. Pre-update, again they were looking kind of balanced at around about 49% or so wins. Renegade Raiders being the most popular detachment, with things like Veterans of the Long War and Soulforged being next, and a few people playing Pact Bounds. It still seems like Chaos Cult is having some good success as well with Accursed Cultist spam, which still seems to be doing some good placings at some big tournaments. The changes in the data slate were fairly limited. Big squads of bikes dropped down to 130, though not that many people were running those before. The smaller unit is just nice and efficient for an Outrider style squad. Veterans and Renegade Raiders will be impacted by the Armour of Contempt change. The 3-inch Deep Strike nerf will hurt Dread Talons, which is a shame given that they're weak already. Predator Annihilators got the small buff of re-rolling all damage rolls, not just once, and they gained the Creations of Bile detachment, focusing on some random buffs to help out melee rush Chaos Space Marine armies, and a bunch of fairly good stratagems to help support them there. Overall, it doesn't really seem like they've been the most impacted by all of this. I feel like perhaps the single biggest nerfs are to the Armour of Contempt equivalents, which will be kind of unhelpful for things like, say, Renegade Raiders, Vindicators perhaps. I guess technically probably a small power loss there. The Predator Annihilator now looks a tiny bit better, and the new detachment could be interesting enough for some people to play with. Seems like they'll broadly be fine to keep on doing what they're doing. I feel like Death Guard have rather got away with doing fairly well and avoiding any nerfs for their strong stuff. They are one of the higher win rate armies in the game, with wins around about 53%. They're still not really all that far ahead of 50. Last time around they got some huge buffs to Death Shroud Terminators, and Mortarian's points cuts made him go from good to pretty great. And this time they didn't have any points changes. Mortarion gained Deep Strike, I guess just to bring him in line with the other Demon Primarchs. They got the Predator Annihilator buff, which isn't awful, though they often tend to prefer Destructors with the extra AP debuffs they can do. And they have their Flyblown Host formation, which does have a few strong bits, but does seem a bit less good versus the Index. Overall, I'd rate them as slight winners compared with before, mainly just due to already seeming a bit ahead of the curve and a few of their top competitors getting nerfed. I don't really think that the changes really improved their strength all that much, but add a few more niche options. But I feel like they're doing rather well just to have stayed where they were. For the World Eaters, Games Workshop pretty well left them alone. They had win rates of 49%, doing nicely enough despite a few nerfs last time around. No points changes this time, and just a few very minor things including the Predator Annihilator change and Demon Princes having their wording altered, so they no longer improve the invulnerable save of Jackals growing to ground for a 6+. Overall, nothing really changing for them. That'll be fairly similar compared with where they were before. They've still got their Grotmust attachment to turn up, so I guess we'll see what they do with that. Maybe if anything for internal balance, perhaps Khan the Betrayer could use a small points drop, though pretty well all their unique stuff is playable enough. Next up, we've got the Thousand Suns. Despite some really quite heavy nerfs last time around, they were still holding steady, wins of around 50. They're definitely lesser played in terms of big events than before, but still seems a small cohort of good players are doing rather well with them, even if there's a few less points to go around. Again, pretty minimal changes here. They got the buff to the Predator Annihilators, not they were really using those at all. I guess Overwatch being declared regardless of whether or not you actually make a charge move could be a bit better for their Warp Flamers, who have particularly savage Overwatch, and their Grotmust attachment was a bit of a disappointment. Their Warping 1 may be considered one of the very weakest so far, perhaps a little bit disappointingly close to what the Index does, and the Index generally is seen as doing it better. I feel like maybe they could have done something a little bit to help encourage the Scarab Occult. Maybe another tiny points cut or something wouldn't have been the worst, but still seems that they'll just be going about doing what they're doing. For the Chaos Demons, they were a bit ahead of the curve with win rates of 53%, generally running some variant of big monster mash demons, pretty much all the greater ones being fairly interesting and powerful, though maybe like the Knights it's put them in a bit more of a position where they tend to be an army that wins a few more games versus big tournaments, though even there they've still taken down a few events. For their changes, Bloodletters went down to 110 points, which I think is quite a nice boost. They are just very easy to drop out of Deep Strike Reserve into the aura of Be'lakor, Bloodthirsters or Scarbrand. And then their Screamers went up a bit at 85 points, but gained Weapon Skill 3+ and anti-keywords. It does make them a bit more dangerous, but a bit less good for just running around and being sacrificial objective units though. Otherwise, they were an army that didn't enjoy the 3-inch Deep Strike nerf. That'll be out to 6 inches now, so it's a bit more niche. It still could be handy occasionally though, if it makes the difference between dropping a squad in the enemy's home field or not, maybe doing an objective, or making them deal with a Great Unclean one back there. Overall, they feel at least fairly similar to where they were before. Better Bloodletters, side-graded Screamers, and a 3-inch Deep Strike nerf. Looks like they'll still remain as one of the stronger armies for win rates and things. And they are going to be the army that gets 4 different Grotmust attachments, so it feels like there's at least a fair chance they'll get something useful. Hopefully they manage to make some sort of monogod playstyle doable. Finally for the Chaos, and we've got the Chaos Knights, again fairly well balanced at win rates are around about 49% or so. Maybe doing a little bit better at the top of tournaments than Knights often do recently. Last update they had a few points drops for their bigger Knights and a small one for their Brigands, and it still seems that the cookie cutter list for them is basically a whole bunch of Carnivores and Brigands spammed. For this update, Games Workshop gave points cuts to the Executioners, Hunters and Stalkers, the lesser played War Dogs out of them, though I'm not sure they're going to be out-competing the very good Carnivores and Brigands at those costs, maybe just getting more in line with them as opposed to actually adding strength and being better. Maybe having a very cheap shooty Executioner could be handy enough for the home field though, rather than a pricier Brigand. Otherwise for points things, the Lord of Dread enhancement got a little bit cheaper. The really big change for them though was they actually finally get their army rule right away now. So now if the enemy units are battle shocks, they're -1 to hit the Chaos Knights, and Chaos Knights will be +1 to wound against them. That is really quite a nice buff, though I guess it's mainly going to apply to things that just happen to be battle shocked round 2, unless you have things like Abominance or the new version of the Traitor's Mark enhancement, which now hands out battle shock, and even then it's not going to be super reliable even with the debuff. Their Grotmust attachment does lack a few things, including Diabolic Bulwark, though on paper at least it does seem kind of interesting. You can have some big damage for the spoilers with Gatling cannons in particular, plus access to very cheap cultists with sticky objectives is a big boon. And he could have other things like Accursed Cultists skirmishing on the midfield. I feel like it's probably not going to outcompete the more cookie cutter indexed attachment though, at least on paper. I feel like the indexed attachment maybe got helped out a bit by the core rule change. Either way though, it's basically all positives for them right now. and probably put them down as slight winners, as I feel like they've gained a bunch of options and the army rule still feels like one that kind of might be helpful from time to time as opposed to reliably great. But in any case, it's still really quite good news for them given that they were pretty solid mid-tier and were winning occasional events before, and it seems that this is an increase in strength for them, not a decrease. Moving on to the Xenos next though, and first up we have the Aeldari. Again, fairly well balanced, win rates of 49%, they didn't get any points changes, and for their rules they got the rather disappointing Grav Tank Grotmus detachment, that unfortunately at the moment just seems directly inferior to the battle host. The big rerolls to hit and wounds just aren't really worth passing up for the extra movement, they already move pretty fast anyway. As a result, I don't really feel like anything has changed for them. At this point though, they're basically in countdown for their codex, getting a whole bunch of new Aspect Warrior kits, and then another 7 detachments on top of this. It'll be interesting to see how good they make their various different playstyles. For the Drukhari, their tournament win rates were 48%, so just very slightly behind the rest of the pack, but not by much. They were taken down by really quite a big amount by the points changes that they got last time around, where previously they both had really high win rates and were also winning lots of big tournaments as well. With the way that they were though, it did feel a bit weird that they basically got nerfs here. Big squads of Grotesques went up 10 points, the Void Raven Bomber went up 20 because Games Workshop hates flyers. Scourges went up by 10 points, which is a shame for them given that they were often a staple unit. They are getting kind of pricey for what they do now, and they just had the one small buff for Rax which went down 5 points per 5 of them. For the Grotmus detachment, they got their Reaper's Wager one. That seems at least fairly fun for melee style Drukhari. In theory, alongside Harlequin allies, I feel like it makes sense to have at least some of them, but you could still run a very Drukhari heavy list. I think it would work quite well with the enhancement. They've got lots of good melee support and then a good core rule for some damage boosts. In general though, definitely feels like a small nerf to them. I feel like the Scourges and the Grotesque squad would be the ones that are most felt. Certainly feels like it'll push them slightly in an unhelpful direction. It's nothing monumental in terms of changes, just a small increase to a couple of units. They're still not really very good feeling for an army that wasn't exactly standout before. For the Tyranids, they were looking pretty well balanced at a 50% win rate or so, mainly using Invasion Fleets, Vanguard Onslaught and Synaptic Nexus, broadly having a pretty good time of it since their big update in summer, where they got a bunch of improved stat lines, some tweaks to rules, and Synapse adding +1 strength for melee stuff. In this update, both the Norn Emissary and the Norn Assimilator dropped 15 points. The Norn Emissary going down is pretty nice given that was already quite powerful. Tyrant Guard dropped down by 5 to 80, and again I thought they were usable enough already. They certainly have massive defensive stats for the cost. Their Assimilation Swarm detachment is genuinely looking interesting now. The Harvester units can heal things even if they're not sat on objectives, and for bigger tougher stuff they heal at D3+1 wounds, plus the Norn Assimilator gains Harvester. I feel like that detachment has always had a few fans, and it certainly got a lot better. The Grotmus detachment was the Warrior one, allowing some pretty nasty damage output for melee warriors. It does already look like it's won a small tournament, which is fun. And I guess the only nerf was to the Trigon, 3-inch deep strike going to 6 inches and no longer rapid ingressing, though it did go down to 150 points by exchange. Overall doesn't really feel like anything too dramatic in terms of power increases. I'd give them slight winner status overall. The Norn Emissary change is helpful, as that was already in a fair few competitive lists, and I feel like most of the rest add better options more so than power. It broadly seems pretty good for them though, for a mid-tier faction to get some slight improvements. Next up though, we've got the army that went from kind of absolute rock bottom when their codex came out, to genuinely quite good again when their cult ambush changes happened, and then quickly became the strongest faction in Warhammer 40k when Games Workshop gave them a whole bunch of points decreases last time around. The Genestealer Cults have pretty much been 40k's strongest faction by the tournament numbers, 60% wins and taking down lots and lots of events, and impressively so for the amount of people playing them, which is never all that many. For their changes this time, the Achilles Ridge Runner went up 10, though it's still great at 85. The Abhorrent went up 20 to stop people running them individually in Biosantic Brood Surge. The Outlander Claw had its objective control rule nerfed, no longer doubling it but just adding 1. The Host of Ascension had its 3-inch deep strike nerfed, but Genestealer Cult in general did get a slight buff to the range of the demolition charges, so that can still take effect out of that kind of deep strike, and the Kellamorph now has its reactive move only work at 9 inches, not 12, so it's no longer quite as reliable just to slink away while shooting literally every single time anyone gets close. The single biggest change though was to Cult Ambush, where they changed it from a system of dice rolls to bring back units to a point system instead, which means that you probably don't get quite as much back over the course of a whole game as you did before. But it also does mean that you can pick and choose the exact ones that you do want back, and make sure that they're the first units to get slain if you want them to be. So it means they can return to the game and deal a bunch of damage sooner rather than later. Overall, I feel like Genestealer Cult got away very lightly with the changes here. They're certainly an army that takes a bit of skill to play, but still are incredibly powerful with a good player that knows the faction well. I don't feel like any one of these changes is particularly killer to them. It definitely feels like it'll take them down a peg, but given how far ahead they were with the numbers, perhaps only to the point where they're sort of vying with the other top factions of the game as opposed to being far ahead of them. In any case, seems pretty good for Xenos cultists out there, and they still do have a Grotmus detachment yet to come as well, which potentially could still have good stuff. Though I feel like they tend to do quite well with multiple different detachments already. It doesn't feel like any one playstyle has been killed too badly by this. Each of their major competitive detachments has taken some slight nerfs, but nothing that's insurmountable. Next up, we've got the Leagues of Votann. Pre-tournament, their win rates were around about 52%, often tending to do a little bit better in win rates versus top event victories, not having as many sneaky tricks and very much playing the damage and defensive kind of game. Their updates were fairly small, Thunderkin down to 80 points per 3 of them, and the Armour of Contempt nerf hit Void Armour. I think that will be felt by Einhir Hearthguard and big units and Hecaton Land Fortresses. Overall, between the two, I don't think it's going to be enormously impactful to them. I think they'll be fairly similar in power compared with where they were before. The Thunderkin didn't tend to get played in all that many competitive lists, and I feel like this helps them catch up with a few bits in the rest of the codex, far more of a force to be reckoned with at 80. But otherwise, Land Fortresses will be a bit more susceptible to a whole bunch of different units focusing fire on them, at least more so than before the Void Armour change. They'll certainly be eagerly awaiting their Grotmus detachment. Will be good to have a second way to play. And of course, the big event for them this year is going to be their codex, hopefully with another wave of miniatures coming. Next up, we've got the Greenskins, who pre-Dataslate had win rates for around 47%. That was a good rise compared with where they were before, after they got some points cuts to Mega Knobs and the Warboss change, but still maybe a little bit lower mid on that kind of ratio, even if they have been winning a few events. For this update, the Warboss and the Mega Armoured Warboss both went up a bit. The regular boss still seems pretty solid. I'm not too sure why they really needed the Mega Boss to go up though. They've gained the datasheet for their Breaker Boys and the new style Tank Busters. I feel like Tank Busters could be an interesting unit in Dread Mob with the shooting synergies, and Breaker Boys do look incredibly dangerous with a Warboss, just not really all that tough to kill once they're out and they've done their damage. The Big Hunt detachment I think could be interesting enough that a few more people might run it in competitive now. The Beast Snagger datasheets are pretty powerful, and now they're able to nominate a character keyword unit as the target for their prey. They're a lot better against the elite infantry style list that they weren't so good at before. And then the biggest and most impactful change for them was the one to the War, now being declared in the command phase as opposed to at the start of the battle round, so you don't have to broadcast that you're going to have the War turn before your opponent's moved, if they happen to be going first. Overall, between all that, it feels solidly helpful. The War change is definitely a big boost, though I feel like the Warboss nerf will be felt as quite a few army lists were spamming multiple of them, and Breaker Boys and Big Hunt more feel like extra options as opposed to things to add raw power. Overall, pretty good news for them, and they'll be having a new detachment which is apparently coming out all very soon. Next up, we've got the Necrons, who have been doing fairly well since the last update. Win rates are around 51%, pretty much the most played army at tournaments, most players choosing to use the Hypercrypt Legion, with Awakened Dynasty being the next most popular. For their changes, they had really quite a lot of points things compared with most. Wraiths went down a bit from their big high of 125, small squads of warriors dropped down to 90, though weren't often being used all that much versus bigger blocks. Ophidian Destroyers went down to 80, the Plasmancer to 60, Ghost Arcs to 115 from 125, and Immortals down to 70 for the smaller squad. For the nerfs, the Royal Warden went up a little bit from 40 to 50, the Hexmark Destroyers from 70 to 75, and then all the Catan minus the Deceiver went up a touch, plus 10 points on all of them. For the most part, I don't really feel like the points changes made enormous amounts of difference, perhaps likely to cost a few top lists a little bit, if you're going for hex marks for warping around the board, or taking a couple of Catan, though maybe the Ophidian Destroyers look a little bit more tempting at 80 points for a unit that can jump on and off the board. The far bigger impact came to their rules changes though, where the Hypercrypt Legion now has one less unit to warp around the board, and also suffered from the 3-inch Deep Strike nerf now being out to 6 inches instead. I feel like those two are pretty impactful for that one, where the main draw is all about just the teleporting and then the 3-inch Deep Strike, perhaps with a few of the enhancements and the movement shenanigans around monoliths being a bonus. That really is going to be a fairly heavy nerf to its utility though, even if I still think it's going to be very playable. As well as that though, they've had 2 other detachments get a glow up. The Annihilation Legion gets a little bit more AP if ranged destroyers target the closest thing to them. It's nice to have that one improved a little bit, but I think that most people are most apprehensive about the Star Shatter arsenal, the Grotmus detachment that helps out Necron vehicles, maybe in particular Doomsday Arks and the Silent King. both of which were really quite powerful units before, seem to be far more scary in that detachment compared with some other places that you could run them, and both of those managed to remain unchanged on the points costs. Overall, feels a bit hard to say exactly where Necrons would wind up. I feel like most people are expecting the Star Shatter Arsenal list to become the most prominent and scary competitive one. It does have some other nice options, such as allowing additional reanimations, which can be big with a reanimator, and that's even quite good for Catan, and also handing out big damage buffs against things on objectives. Overall, between the lot of things, it feels like Hypercrypt Legion lost. Most other things would stay fairly similar with some pros and cons, where the Star Shatter Arsenal looks like it's going to be similar sort of power levels or better compared with the previous Hypercrypts. I think I wouldn't be too surprised if Necrons wound up being one of the stronger factions after the update, though I guess we'll see. Finally for factions, last but not least, we have the Tau Empire. Again, an army that was pretty balanced previously, win rates for around about 49%, with the most popular detachment being the Retaliation Cadre, but Mont'ka and Cao Yon also being played. Their balanced dataslate changes basically had two things: Tiger Sharks being increased by plus 50 points, again being a flyer that had been dangerously relevant, at least before the issues with it not being able to shoot on the turn that it arrives. But the biggest and most impactful thing fell to the Retaliation Cadre, where they have that 2 command point stratagem that allows a 3-inch deep strike. That one becoming a 6-inch deep strike is really quite a big deal, as it doesn't allow you to trigger the closer range detachment buff anymore, the one that gives you extra AP, and it also doesn't allow you to get in melter range for fusion blasters anymore, which often were a fairly popular choice, dropping close with Farsight. Overall, that one does feel like a feels bad change. It does feel like something that the detachment was balanced around and definitely wasn't overpowered with, particularly given that that one was a big 2 command point stratagem rather than one like certain other ones had. Overall, as a result from the update, they're certainly losers. I'd probably put them down as slight losers as opposed to big. I feel like Retaliation Cadre will definitely have a big hit to its power, and I wouldn't be surprised if a bunch of people pivot back towards Mont'ka or Cao Yon some more. Though I still don't think that this single change is going to be the difference between them being at the very bottom of the meta. I still think they'd be mid-tier. In any case though, that's the main factions talked about. Broadly speaking, I feel like there's more good stuff than bad here between the balance update and the Grotmus detachments, though perhaps compared with the last one I wouldn't be too surprised if a few armies might move in the wrong directions. Tournament win rates and things do seem to have been kind of remarkably well balanced, even if Genestealer Cult and Guard have been running off with a whole load of trophies. I think while for the most part the strongest armies have got nerfed a bit and a few of the weakest ones have received help, I do feel like there's a few weirder decisions to me. I feel like perhaps the hits to Sisters, Grey Knights and Drukhari were a bit too much. Really disappointing not to see Imperial Agents get anything either. I'd guess that Genestealer Cult are probably going to be towards the very top of the tree. Necrons look like they could be one of the strongest armies, and Death Guard were in a pretty good spot and still look like they're remaining there. It's going to be interesting to see the fallout of the Codex Space Marine changes as well, and how well they start doing after this. I did quite enjoy seeing a few of the detachments get help as well though, things like Assimilation Swarm, the Chaos Knight Core rule, and the Annihilation Legion getting some help. All of those seem like quite good changes. Let me know your thoughts though. How would you rate your faction's changes in the balance update, and do you think they've got stronger or weaker as a result? Finally though, I'll just circle back to talk about Titan's Terrain once more, the video sponsor, for those of you who are interested in their pop-up battlefield system. All the various different 40k terrain sets out there do come with their advantages and disadvantages. As mentioned earlier, I'd say the main advantages of this one are that it's really quite easy to store and transport due to the whole folding system that they've got going on. It's far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, and generally a bit cheaper than things like MDF or sculpted plastic ones for the most part. And you also don't need any painting or assembly for it, it's all ready to go immediately, which I'm sure is a selling point for many. For disadvantages, the cardboard styling of it does have some trade-offs. It's a bit less hard-wearing than some sets of terrain, as you'd expect given that it needs to be designed to fold flat. It can be a bit more difficult to put models in the upper floors of it, as not all of them bear weight very well. And the grid layout can have a little bit less flexibility with terrain setups. You can get a fair bit of variety with rotating the squares and things, though it can create some firing lanes potentially. Just a tiny bit of extra terrain just to break those up could be a reasonable idea. It won't do tournament layouts or anything like that, but I think we'll do enough line of sight blocking for most people's purposes for more casual games of 40k. In any case, for the options for the sets they have, they've got this Forgotten Furnace one. Their standard boxes are £112, $140 or €130. Links down in the video description. This one's a sort of Chaos Factory type affair. Lots of glowing furnaces covered in runes. They've got a more standard Ruined City Shattered Hive one, bombed out buildings and a few armoured containers. And then an Overgrown Capital one that could both apply to fantasy or more futuristic settings. Some more oldie worldy style ruins. Each of those also have a centrepiece as well, a great big cathedral thing for the city and the capital ones, and a big infernal spire for the Furnace one. They come as an expansion to the main set, and they're basically made from 2 tiles pushed together. In any case though, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video, and feel free to check out the link in the video description if you want to have a look over their range. In any case though, I'll leave this one there for now. Let me know your thoughts as to the 40k armies post Dataslate down in the comments. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. And if you'd like to support the channel, there's the Patreon page linked in the video description, plus the channel's affiliate discount links as well for Warhammer but a bit cheaper. Feel free to check them out too. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.